I call Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak in the second reading of this bill. This would normally be the point at which we would be reflecting upon the interesting and diverse submissions that had come to the Select Committee, which would have been set up. I imagine a bill of this type would have attracted a lot of interest. Actually, there would have been a lot of hearings. There would have been the traditional argument between opposition and government members about whether 5 minutes or 10 minutes is actually enough for a submitter to make their point, and we would have jousted over that and got our way through. I predict we probably would have travelled, the Select Committee would have travelled on this bill and gone to Auckland and Christchurch and taken on board the views of people from right across the country. Well, actually, the Minister interjects and says it's such a burning issue. Actually, it is. It actually is something that worries and concerns New Zealanders, and it's because, I believe, of the reasons I mentioned in my first reading speech, that the concerns are not so much about what we as politicians are being paid, but actually about what ordinary working New Zealanders are being paid, and the fact that they haven't had a pay increase. 40-odd% of them in the last year haven't had a pay increase. That's what drives the anger, the concern, the fact that there is a greater disparity being created yet again by this. So I do want to make the point in all seriousness that clearly it is less than desirable to have now moved immediately to the second reading of this bill. I think everyone in the House would recognise that a piece of legislation like this would benefit from a committee stage process. There is, any time you see an algebraic equation show up in a piece of legislation, that should go to a select committee. And I think it's really important that when we're well, no, actually, things went wrong for maths for me when they started including letters with the numbers, Mr Woodhouse. But no, the fact is that when we get a piece of legislation like this with a formula-based approach, it would be better if this was before a select committee. What we know, and the reason why the Labour Party is supporting this piece of legislation is, as I said in my first reading contribution, because we share the goal that the kind of pay increase that was put forward by the Remuneration Authority for us is not right. It is not acceptable. We want to see MP pay much more closely aligned with what average workers are getting in terms of pay increases, and this bill takes us a step in that direction. It's not, to my mind, the end of this discussion, but it is a step away from the kinds of pay increases that were proposed in recent weeks. Mr. Speaker, I want to take a moment to talk about some of the issues that the Minister raised in his speech at the start of this second reading. The first of those is around the whole question of what has happened to Chief Executive pay. And this is relevant because that is the relativity that is going on here, or executive pay more broadly, shall we say. That's the relativity that the Remuneration Authority looks at under Section 18 of their Act. And there is no doubt that we've seen massive pay increases for chief executives in the public and the private sector. And the Minister's actually just plain wrong to assert that that is not what has happened in New Zealand. My own view, Mr. Speaker, is that actually there should be no public service chief executive paid more than the Prime Minister. I don't understand that. I think that that sends the wrong signals. I simply don't believe when we're getting up to the 400,000, 500,000, 600,000 thing area that we are in a situation where there is some kind of concern about recruitment of quality people for those roles. I think that is wrong. And, you know, we've got the State Services Commissioner who got a 9% pay increase after a shocker of a year, Mr. Speaker, frankly. What kind of situation are we in when those kind of pay increases are going on? And as I said earlier, you know, when we get to the point where we've got the average in New Zealand workplaces being a CE paid 26 times the average worker, we have got ourselves out of whack. I note, if you look at the ANZ, the ANZ chief executive is paid 120 times the lowest paid worker within the ANZ, with a $4.1 million salary for the ANZ chief executive. That is out of control. That is disproportionate. What we need in New Zealand is a sustained program of lifting the wages of ordinary New Zealanders, and that comes through a variety of means. It does, Mr. Speaker, come through productivity increases. There's no doubt about that. But that disjuncture that I mentioned in the first reading between productivity growth in New Zealand in the last 25 years in wage increases needs further exploration, and that is around some questions about the bargaining power of workers, around the real value of the minimum wage. Those are the real considerations around wages in New Zealand which are being ignored by this government, and now we have this piece of legislation to paper over the cracks that we've got here. I certainly don't think that the Minister didn't address in his contribution to my satisfaction, and I hope we come back to it in the committee stage of this debate, the question of the particular mechanism being chosen here, the QES for public service workers, the Quarterly Employment Survey for public service workers, as the best benchmark we can have. The two concerns I have about that, the first of those is the fact that public sector pay is in the control of politicians in all sorts of ways. We've got Bill English on the television saying on Sunday 4%'s out for teachers, nurses and police. Now, we can certainly debate the merits of whether that's fair or not, but that indicates the level of control a politician has about that. We all know that. We all know that when the Ministry of Education sits down with the teacher unions later this year, what they're negotiating comes back to the table of the ministers. So the very thing we're about to benchmark ourselves to is in the control of ministers, and that takes us back years in terms of whether or not we should be setting our own pay. As my colleague Chris Hipkins said earlier, you know, we can put it up, we can put it down. This provides me with my biggest issue with this bill, and I want to hear from the Minister in the committee stages why the QES for public sector workers has been used. Why not look across the whole economy? That takes that out of the equation, because there are public servants all over New Zealand who are now thinking, well, this is just going to mean an absolute certainty that we're down to 1% or lower in pay increases, because the politicians will be too scared to put the pay up because it will lift their pay as well. On the other side of the fence, there are committees of Parliament all the time debating these issues. So the Officers of Parliament Committee are right now debating pay and salary around the Ombudsman, around other officers of Parliament as well. We are constantly, as politicians, involved in what it is that makes up public sector pay. And I think the government needs to explain very carefully to us why they are limiting this to the public sector. If we looked across the economy more broadly, then I would have more comfort. As I say, I think it's a step in the right direction because it delinks us from the runaway executive salaries, but it doesn't, in my view, provide a broad enough look across the economy at wage increases, and I think we need to take another look at that. Mr. Speaker, I think it's really important also that we go back to asking the Minister to describe in some more detail the difference between the QES as a measure and other measures of public sector pay as well, and I'm sure he will do that as those concerns have been raised online. So, Mr. Speaker, in the second reading of the bill, we once again on the Labor Party side find ourselves in the position of supporting a piece of legislation that takes a step forward to ensuring we don't get silly, disproportionate, unrealistic pay increases like that proposed by the Remuneration Authority, and we are drawn closer to the experience of working New Zealanders in terms of the kinds of pay increases they've got. But it is highly suboptimal to be here today having not had this go to a select committee, having had year after year of the Prime Minister tell us we must do something about this, and then we have to rush this through because, as my colleague Annette King said, the shambles that would be created about that pay going into our account and then coming out again would be ridiculous. So we have to get this done, but the fact is that the government has dropped the ball around this issue consistently now, and now brings to us something where there are still many, many questions outstanding which we will take up in the committee stages.